All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Patty Habeck. I am the President and CEO of New North. On behalf of New North and our partners, UW Green Bay, the Greater Green Bay Chamber, Progress Lakeshore, and Kane Communications, welcome. We also want to thank Bolt and the WPS Foundation for their support in making tonight's event possible. We're glad to see so many municipal leaders and community partners here for what we know is an increasingly important topic. As interest in data center development continues to grow, communities across Wisconsin are being asked to evaluate opportunities that come both with complexity and impact. Tonight's session is designed to be a neutral educational forum, a space to provide clear, fact-based information and multiple perspectives to support thoughtful, informed decision-making at the local level. The speakers you'll hear from this evening were invited because they are industry experts in the state of Wisconsin, each bringing deep experience and perspective in their respective fields, from policy and infrastructure to energy, water, community development, and future trends. In addition to tonight's conversation, New North created a data center resource hub on our website, and we're curating research, recordings, and educational materials to support communities as they continue learning and evaluating these issues. We'll share more about that tonight after the event. We're also very fortunate to be guided this evening by our moderator, Megan Dickman-Renard. Megan is the CEO and publisher of the Business News and the CEO of Dickman Media Group. Her background in community storytelling, media ethics, and emerging technologies makes her especially well-suited to lead a thoughtful, balanced conversation on a topic like this. I also want to thank our speakers and our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us this evening. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Megan, who will guide us through this discussion. Megan?
Wonderful. Thank you, Patty, and good evening, everyone. I want to echo first some of the intention for tonight's event and underscore the importance of having forums like this where we can talk about large, multifaceted topics in an educational and neutral way, where we can ground ourselves in facts and leverage the perspectives of industry professionals and leaders as we seek to gain greater understanding. The program tonight strives to cover some foundational information as well as applied community-focused perspectives. I tend to think of this in terms of what it looks like on paper versus what it looks like in practice. The goal tonight is understanding, it's not advocacy, and the goal is to give information so that each and every one of you can assess what makes the most sense for you in your own local context. So a few things to bear in mind as we navigate this evening. She's reminding me where the clicker is. So first and foremost, thank you all for being here. The only way that conversations like this can happen about substantive topics like data centers, we welcomed her. Thank you, Patty. There's me. Okay, our agenda, amazing, is when we're able to get in a room together and have an open discourse. I also want to take just a moment to recognize some of the representatives from the federal level, the state level, the county level, and the local municipal leaders who are present with us today. Thank you so much for being here. So second, as you can see the agenda, I want to talk just a little bit about the structure for tonight. So we're going to have two panel discussions. The first is going to cover topics related to infrastructure, energy, environment, and policy. And the second will be related to community impact. There will also be a short video prior to our first panel that provides a brief overview on what data centers are from a functional standpoint. And in between panels, we'll have a presentation that covers it from the community perspective at a more localized level, and then a macro level perspective. We've got a futurist who's going to be chatting with us today as well, where they will seek to answer the question, what's in it for the community? The other tool that we will have available to us today, papers. So throughout the night, we'll also have something called Mentimeter, and we'll be able to submit questions through it. You'll see a QR code displayed alongside each of the panels, and you're able to kind of select with your phone and submit questions. I think this is always really important when we talk about something like education. You need to be able to ask questions. So no, that's going to go to the iPad that I have right here. So during the panel discussions, I'll be able to take some of your own questions and bring them up. So that does mean, of course, you're welcome to be on your phone. You're encouraged to be on your phone as you're doing that. Just please keep your phones on silent. So as I said, for me, education is really important. Ask a question, your engagement is essential. And then, as Patty had mentioned, the session is being recorded, and it will be shared after the event as part of New North's Data Center Resource Hub. If you're interested in learning more about that, I'm fairly confident both Patty and Barbara would be happy to talk a little bit more about what's going to be housed there, what that looks like. So with that in mind, let's start by orienting ourselves in a little bit of foundational information. So to begin, we'll start with a short video that covers what data centers are, what they power, and the infrastructure required to support them. I do want to acknowledge, as we start heading into the video, that it is a video that's created by Google, and it's part of a series that they have. The video is not selected to promote Google. It was selected because it provides a clear, straightforward explanation that stays kind of at, that covers just the functionality at a data center level. So with that, we're going to go there first.
A Google search, a YouTube video, a connected Nest device, and hundreds of Google Cloud services all give you a response in a fraction of a second. But what really happens when you click search, send a request, or say, "Okay, Google"? Well, your message travels over the public internet and into Google's global fiber network. Millions of these requests, or packets of data, travel through miles of cable over land and undersea, converging at one of the many data centers we operate all over the world. But besides delivering quick results back to you, what exactly is a data center? A data center is a building with powerful computers used to run a company's services. It's where information is processed and made available. Data is stored, managed, and disseminated across these computers, and network infrastructure is installed to support web apps, databases, virtual machines, and more. Often, organizations start with their own modest buildings, made up of a few server racks, which requires maintaining these systems, paying for cooling, and handling increasing demand. So, many companies look to a cloud services provider like Google Cloud. These providers' data centers have evolved into large campuses of multiple buildings. Hyperscale data centers, made up of tens of thousands of servers, process big data, support cloud computing, and serve billions of users for services like Chrome, Maps, Gmail, Search, and Google Cloud. In the cloud world, companies and users can benefit from this scale because of a special thing called multi-tenancy. This means customers can share the resources of each server in a data center, like tenants sharing common resources of an apartment building. Each tenant's cloud systems are isolated and invisible to other tenants. This means higher compute processing and storage, a more efficient use of data center resources, and a much lower cost than if you manage your own servers. Google Cloud customers can even deploy resources in regions across the world, which are enterprise data center locations with 3 or more zones. Zones are deployment areas that map to clusters of machines with distinct physical infrastructure. Companies can deploy workloads across multiple zones to help protect against unexpected failures, something you can't always get with a single private data center. It takes the right mix of energy, cooling, and people to keep a data center up and running. But it's a technical feat Google's managed to pull off to optimize for efficiency, scale, and cost. More on that next time on Discovering Data Centers.
Wonderful. So, with that overview in mind, what I would like to do now is transition to our very first presentation. So that is with Jason Stein, president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, who will touch on data center energy and water use and regulation. So Jason Stein has worked with the Wisconsin Policy Forum since 2018 and has served as president since July 2024, previously holding roles as vice president and research director. His policy research has earned multiple awards from the Governmental Research Association, reflecting the forum's commitment to data-driven, nonpartisan analysis. Please join me in welcoming Jason Stein.
Well, thanks, everybody, and thank you, Megan, for the nice introduction, and delighted to be here, and I'll try and make this quick so we can get to the other panelists. But the forum, just to tell you a little bit about ourselves, we've been around since long before there were data centers. In 1913, we were formed in Milwaukee, and in 2018, through the merger of the Public Policy Forum of Milwaukee and the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance of Madison, We do not advocate for or against specific policies. So I am here neither to sell you a data center or to get any halted or moratorium, just to provide information and look forward to the discussion. The forum is made up of hundreds of members. One example, a local member here in the Green Bay area is the George Kress Foundation, but hundreds of corporations, nonprofits, school districts, local governments, and individuals around the state. Any of you who are here as individuals, who are here as a local government official, would be free to join the forum, and you can find information on our website. So tonight I'm going to talk about impacts of data centers on energy and water usage in Wisconsin. But this is from a brief that we published to our website at wispolicyforum.org. All of this research and everything else we do is available there for free. We have a larger project that are just now launching that's sponsored by the Milwaukee Metropolitan Association of Commerce, the League of Wisconsin Municipalities Forward Janesville, and the Greater Madison Chamber of Commerce that's going to look at the issue of data centers and data center siting in more depth, and we'll publish sometime this summer, so look for that. All right, so a little bit of context for data centers. As you can see, there are dozens of them around the state, and not necessarily all in the industry of technology. There are also old line businesses like insurers that make use of these centers. What's really different about the current data center debate is more than anything a matter of scale. So, some of the larger hyperscale data centers that are being proposed in Wisconsin around the country can use a gigawatt of electricity at one time, or over the course of a year, about at 1 gigawatt hour. So if you think about it, there's kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, and each one is 1,000 up from the previous one, okay? So megawatts, 1,000 kilowatt hours, gigawatts, 1,000 megawatt hours. Maybe it's a little easier to just describe that using 1 gigawatt amounts to something like 1.5% of the total energy being produced in the state. So, when we look at the water issue, I think you'll see from context, I think some of the concerns around water usage may be put in a larger context or to a larger degree than they are. Around power, it's a significant issue that needs to be worked out as part of the policy. Data centers currently use a little more than 4% of all electricity in the United States. The Federal Energy Information Administration projects that by 2028, data centers would use something like 7 to 12%. So, Wisconsin could be in that range, is a significant increase associated with these. But we also need some context for understanding what's been happening with power usage prior to data centers. So here's a look at power usage in Wisconsin over the last 20 years. These are electricity sales by all utilities in Wisconsin in megawatt hours, which as reported to the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, which regulates power and water utilities. And you can see that there's been a 9% drop in those sales in megawatt hours over the past 20 years, led by a 10.6% drop in industrial and commercial users. So, that's reflecting the fact that with respect to industrial sales, you think about manufacturing operations in Wisconsin, they have gotten leaner, they've gotten more efficient, and in some cases, they've left the state altogether. And so, we have that falling demand for power. When you think about electricity demand, you can think about it in terms of what is sold over the course of a year, or you can think about it in terms of peak demand. Peak demand has also seen a decline, but not quite as steep. So it's declined from a high of 15 gigawatts in 2006 to 14.6 in 2024, or a little under 3% drop. Utility projections to the PSC expect peak demand for electricity to increase in Wisconsin to a little over 17 gigawatts over the next 5 years, with data center expansion being a significant component of that. Okay, so we can think about just the megawatt hours of power that are being sold, but we can also think about the revenue associated with that. And so here you can see the long-term downward trend in actual revenues from utility sales. And you can see that the gray line is combined revenue for both investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities, which are your smaller component at the bottom. That revenue is down, it depends on if you look at it from the peak or from just over the last 20 years, but from the peak in 2011, on an inflation-adjusted basis, it's down a little over 15%. Now, again, there's lots of ways to think about it. You can think about it from an environmental perspective, and that's positive. But you can also, the fact that we're selling fewer megawatt hours of electricity, but you can also look at it from the standpoint of there are investments that we have to do in our grid, whether it's generation or transmission, to transition to renewables, to ensure reliability. And those investments have got to be spread out or amortized by whatever revenue the system is generating. And so another way to think about it as well is if you're trying to make investments in your system and you have falling revenues on an inflation-adjusted basis to do that, that's not a perfect scenario either. Okay, so let's look at water sales in the state. So first, these are figures that get reported to the Wisconsin Public Service Commission from municipal water utilities all around Wisconsin. And it's worth noting that water does also get pulled out of the ground for irrigation, private wells, other uses. But this is still a very significant component of the water use in the state. And you can see here, this is over the past 25 years from 97 to 2022. The light blue line at the top is residential water use in billions of gallons each year. Dark blue is industrial, gray is commercial, and the green is other. And what we see since 97 to 2022, total water sales in the state fell by 18%, or more than 30 billion gallons, which is about the same amount of water that's held in Lake Monona in Madison, if you can picture that. Residential purchases around Wisconsin over that period declined by more than 10 billion gallons, or 16%, and you had a really big drop in industrial water use, dropping by more than 17 billion gallons, or 34%. Again, if you think about those of us, those of you who are my age or older in the state, you can think about in all your individual communities, whether it's paper plants or manufacturing plants, other types of processing facilities, how many of them have closed or gotten smaller, gotten more water efficient. And just in Madison, for example, 25 years ago, you had the Oscar Mayer plant, you had the Sara Lee Bakery, you had industrial dairies that were operating in the city. All those operations they're not just more efficient, they're gone entirely in the city. And so, even though the population of Madison has grown quite substantially over the past generation, the water usage is down, as we'll see in just a second. So here's a look at just communities around the state and what's happened with their water usage over time, again, from the late 90s, going up to the period before the sort of arrival of hyperscale data centers on the scene. And what you can see is that there are multiple communities in Wisconsin where the water sales over that period have actually gone down by hundreds of millions of gallons or even billions of gallons. So City of Milwaukee Water Utility, Milwaukee Water Works, down more than 6 billion gallons. The Racine Water Works, down more than 2 billion gallons over that time period, which the Racine Water Works obviously serves the village of Mount Pleasant, where the Microsoft data center is located. I would have liked to have included Green Bay here. We didn't include them. They're not included on the list of the biggest drops because from our limited read of the data, I think the Green Bay Water Utility took on additional territory over the period in question. So their water sales went up. But I think if you looked at them on a apples to apples basis and you don't include the territory that got added, the Green Bay Water Utility sales would also be down over this period. We also looked at, the Mount Pleasant and the Racine Water Works, the sales of Racine over the time period since 2022 to today, and we found that water sales by that utility had grown by less than 2%, even though it has, one of the world's biggest, one of the nation's biggest data centers operating there. And part of that, I think, is, again, if you think about it, you'll hear about a data center like that, and you'll hear, water usage up into the millions of gallons, and it sounds like a lot of water, and it can be a lot of water, but you have to also think about it in the context of, what have we been doing historically in the state? And like a lot of Rust Belt areas, we're just not using water the way we once did. Okay, I'll try and move through the rest of this quickly, but I had been asked to just sort of give a context about, well, when you think about state and local government and the federal government, who is even providing oversight of data centers? So a few examples we have on the local government side. Municipalities control things like zoning, permitting, and other land use decisions. They also control the annexation process to the extent to which, there's an annexation as part of a data center. Now that's still within the limits and requirements and oversight of the state. Municipalities also levy and collect property tax rates and set property tax rates. Counties, school districts, and other taxing districts also levy property taxes and set rates. Municipalities also create tax increment districts, which may or may not be involved in the creation of a data center. Those, although it's a municipal run process, there's also an important vote that happens in the local joint review board that have representation from other taxing districts. Then municipalities also provide, many basic services like water, sewer, roads, other infrastructure, as well as basic emergency services like police, fire protection, EMS, that all relate to both a data center that's operating and while the construction is happening. In terms of, we just talked about water and power issues. Again, that data is collected and that oversight and regulation happens by the Wisconsin Public Service Commission in our state. It's important to note that although many states have a similar entity, where I grew up, it's the Kansas Corporation Commission. There are also other states where they're deregulated and, electric utilities are not under the same oversight that they would be here in Wisconsin. So, that is when we talk about the impact of data centers on utility prices, that is an important check that exists in our system that does not exist in every other state. Again, as part of that regulation process, the PSC is approving both rate requests as well as construction of generation assets. Okay, other agencies that have some responsibility include, if we're talking about environmental considerations like stormwater considerations, if there's a wetland that's being filled as part of a project, air emissions, stormwater permits, and sewer plant permits. The Wisconsin Department of Resources and regional planning commissions play a role. Potentially, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers may also play a role. And then in addition, at the level of the state, we have a statewide building code, and we have that's overseen by the Department of Safety and Professional Services. Other relevant agencies that work on data centers, the State Department of Revenue enforces the tax increment financing regulations and also collects state and income taxes. The Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation Under Wisconsin law, there are sales and use tax exemptions for equipment that goes into data centers. Though those are similar in some ways to the sales tax exemption that exists for manufacturing equipment in the state, and those are allocated by the WEDC. There's 4 data centers in Wisconsin that have had those exemptions allocated: the Microsoft in Mount Pleasant, Epic Systems in Verona, Meta in Beaver Dam, and Vantage in Port Washington. A little bit more details on those sales tax exemptions. They cover computer servers, networking equipment, cooling equipment on these sites. They are certified by WEDC, as I said, and as part of receiving them, developers must commit to a minimum investment based on county population, and it's $150 million for buildings in a county of 100,000 residents. The intended impact of these, again, we don't advocate for, again, specific policies, but I think the legislation was intended to encourage capital investment in data centers in the state. It is somewhat similar to the manufacturing exemption that already existed. One difference, though, is that many manufactured goods would be subject to the sales tax, at least at the retail level, whereas many data center services would not be subject to sales tax, just because in Wisconsin, goods tend to be subject to the sales tax more than services. Okay. The other thing, last thing I'll talk about just on a policy standpoint is we do have, for those data center projects that involve a tax increment financing district, there is a limit in state law of TIDs, for all TIDs in a community, of 12% of equalized property value. And we've had a couple data centers where there's been an exemption created in state law, that's Port Washington and Beaver Dam, to allow them to exceed that limit. What is the limit there for? It's a couple things. It's one, that there can represent risk to have more of a community in a TID district. Again, it depends on the terms of the financing. That may or may not be the case, but that can be the case in some instances. And then the 12% limit is also because the increment, so the property value that gets added to a district once it's created, does go to paying off any infrastructure that's financed by the district. And until then, that revenue from those property taxes are not available to other taxing entities like the school district and county. So there's a desire to limit that. At the same time, when you talk about a relatively small community like a Port Washington, it's not a huge community, and then you have many billions of dollars of value get added within a tax increment district, then it is going to, in many cases, bump them over that limit, and then that's something that's just got to be considered by policymakers, both at the local and state level. And that's it. Again, you can find out more about this research by just going to our website or to join the forum as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason, for that overview. So with that, we're going to launch into our first panel discussion. So this, as I had mentioned, will be a discussion of some of the infrastructure, energy demands, and the environmental side of it. So with that, if I could welcome all the panelists, and then I'll do a little bit of an introduction on each of you. So you already heard from Jason Stein, president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Thank you again. And then I also have Peter Annan. So Peter Annan is a veteran journalist and award-winning author whose work has focused on water policy and environmental issues for more than 2 decades. He currently serves as executive director of the Burke Center for Ecosystem Research, a nonpartisan science and policy research center based in Ashland, Wisconsin. Welcome. And I also have Bert Garvin, who is Executive Vice President of External Affairs for WEC Energy Group and its subsidiaries, including We Energies and Wisconsin Public Service. He oversees legislative and regulatory affairs at the federal, state, and local levels, focusing on energy policy, infrastructure, and stakeholder engagement. Welcome. So I do want to call out that is the QR code that I was talking about for the Mentimeter thing. So if you have questions during these, as I said, they'll go right to my iPad that I have here. Feel free to scan the QR code and send questions that you might have. I'm going to get us started, but as I said, feel free. So to get us to dive in, so as we begin to talk about data center development, from each of your perspectives, what's the most important factor that a community should understand about data centers today?
Well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to be here tonight. I appreciate it. The data center developments we're seeing in the state of Wisconsin where we serve are historic, and it's changing, the communities where we serve and all our other customers. We're not a startup. We started in 1896, so we got a few years on the policy forum. But, the statistics that Jason pointed to shows you over the last 25 years, sales have been flat, load growth has been 0.1% or flat. Now you're seeing utilities like our We Energies franchise, it's going to grow by 40% in the next 5 years. And with that, and we're a publicly rated utility, you're going to get a lot of scrutiny over that. We welcome that because, what I get asked these type of events is two things. This is great for Wisconsin, but I don't want my constituents paying for it. And then what happens if they don't show up? Now, I'll talk about our customer protection plan, but for the communities that are affected like Mount Pleasant and Port Washington, there's significant interest in these projects. I guess at Mount Pleasant, because it's the old Foxconn site, it's a very mature site. When you look at Port Washington, the Vantage project, you're talking about a community of 10,000 people, and you're having the largest capital infrastructure project in state history being built right there, $15 to $30 billion. So a lot of interest, and I'm happy to answer other questions, but that's my initial remarks on this.
Oh, perfect. Peter?
Yeah, well, I'm as Megan said, I'm a journalist and author. I'm not an advocate, and I'm also a self-described water geek. So any advice I would have would definitely be from a water perspective. I wrote a book about the Great Lakes Compact about 20 years ago, and the Great Lakes Compact, as many of you know, was a legal water fence designed to keep Great Lakes water inside the Great Lakes watershed so the jobs come to the water and we don't send the water to jobs somewhere else. And it's mainly known as an anti-water diversion document. However, the compact also has sections on in-basin consumptive use. And the key number for me today is 5 million gallons per day. The governors and premiers and their staffs who wrote the Great Lakes Compact and the international agreement with the province of Ontario and Quebec set that limit for consumptive use. If it's less than 5 million gallons per day, we're not worried about it. That's how much water we have in the Great Lakes watershed. If it's above 5 million gallons per day, you have to let the rest of us know, and we're going to have a conversation. To Mount Pleasant, as a journalist, I am frustrated by the non-disclosure agreements in the data center industry because I'm into transparency and I want to know what's going on when I'm writing and speaking about these water issues. We have a case study in Mount Pleasant because there was litigation against Microsoft to disclose its water consumption. And that number came out in the fall of last year with phase 1 around 3 million gallons per year, and up to phase 4, 8.4 million gallons per year, as opposed to the compact limit of 5 million gallons per day. So as a water geek looking at Microsoft's plans for Mount Pleasant, it's a non-story in terms of water consumption. And I think I'd love to hear more from Bert. I think that what we're going to see with these data centers, especially the growth, the amazing growth that Bert just mentioned, I think the consumption of water from these data centers is going to be greater from the electrical generation that keeps them humming than the actual water consumption from the cooling in the centers themselves.
So Jason, I'll end up going to you, but Peter, if you don't mind, I'd love to dig a little deeper on one of the things you talked about. And as we know, water use varies by how the facility is designed. There's a whole different kind of spectrum of ways that facilities can use water. Some are heavy water users, some are closed loop. What kinds of questions should community members, should municipal leaders be asking about a facility design if they want to get clarity on how it's going to be using water?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the simplest thing is a closed loop system like the system that I'm talking about that Microsoft is using is really cutting edge. And, a lot of the data that's out there is from legacy data centers. Sorry to use data in the same sentence there twice, but those are data centers that did consume a lot more water in the past. But we have this cutting edge technology that is really hot right now. And it is this closed loop water recycling, sometimes referred to as a water recycling system, that is the really, from a water consumption standpoint, is the best way to go.
Please.
Did you want me to speak to just what community leaders might want to be thinking about if
Yeah,
they,
I'm going to
if they have
circle
a data
back to you on
center?
that.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and I have a lot of sympathy for someone who, they're sitting in the village of X or the town of Y, and they got elected 3 years ago, and all of a sudden, they're deciding on what could be an $8 billion project in their community. It wasn't necessarily what they signed up to do when they threw their name in the hat to be an elected official. But I think that the thing that I would say is, if you look at the national numbers right now, there's some evidence that we might be in a recession without data centers, without the sort of the development that's surrounding that. So I think when you think about economic opportunity for a community, if there's interest in their community being a site for it, I think it's worth them, given that this is what's hot in the economy right now, to hear the developer or the operator out and understand that it's certainly going to be a very big change, and I'm not here to make the sale on that for people. But at the same time, and there can be risk associated with it. On the other hand, I've seen a lot of creative and notable ways that risk is being mitigated within agreements and proposals. And so I think that's, that more so than in some other economic developments situations I've seen, communities have some leverage and some ability to negotiate pretty remarkable deals in a lot of ways, and it's a question of kind of rolling up their sleeves and really getting into those details.
From kind of some of the policy standpoint, so how are data centers different, and Jason, I'm bothering you again, are different from kind of other types of large-scale industrial development? Does Wisconsin's current policy framework reflect some of the differences that would be between data centers versus some of the large-scale development?
I mean, I think one of the big differences is just the scale. Mm-hmm. When you think about a capital investment of $10 million, you can wait a long time to see outside of the data center world that sort of capital investment come to a community in Wisconsin. So the scale is notable. I think another thing that's notable is, not in every case is our communities are not necessarily putting the same level of incentives on the table for these that you see for some other things. I mean, there certainly have been TIF investments at the same time. In some cases, either, like in the proposal in the village of DeForest, which did not proceed, but there wasn't actually, the developer was proposing to pay for the infrastructure investment. In other cases, like Vantage, there's been a discussion of actually the borrowing being done by the private entity rather than by the municipality. And so the risk being assumed on the private side rather than on the public side. And by and large, we have the state sales tax exemption, but the other types of enterprise zone credits that you might see, like corporate and individual income tax credits being given out, largely not happening for these centers, as you might see for other development projects around the state. So that's another thing that stands out about them.
We do have a question here that, I think it's related to something you touched on, but one of the questions that I had gotten was just what elements of a data center are actually subject to that local property tax?
Well, I mean, like any other parcel, it would be the improvements on the parcel. We no longer, the state repealed our personal property tax provisions. So once upon a time in Wisconsin, personal property such as business and commercial equipment would be subject at times to the property tax. That's no longer the case. But again, any improvements that would be made in that land in terms of structures or moving of the land, grading and that sort of thing, those would all be subject to the property tax. I mean, and in certain cases, some of these deals have included guaranteed valuations. So in other words, that's a stipulation made by the developer, the operator, that we will grant you that there will be a property value of X on this parcel for a given period of time, even if under market conditions, the property does not turn out to be assessed at that value in the future, let's say because the market got soft or something like that occurred. So those would be some of the considerations to think about in terms of how the properties are valued and how they would be taxed.
Bert, you've been quiet for a little bit, so I'm going to bother you. So one of the questions that I had was just, so how are organizations approaching the question of who pays for the infrastructure upgrades that data centers require? And I realize, Jason, you touched on this a little bit, but from your vantage point.
Sure, that's a great question. But before I answer that, because I'm getting older, I want to respond to Peter's comment.
Sounds good.
With all the generation facilities we're building, we're obviously concerned about water usages too. You look over time, 10, 20 years, because we retired a lot of coal units, which were big water users. I mean, it's sort of on the trajectory you've suggested. Plus, we've really implemented in all of the above energy. We're building batteries, solar, wind. You can't build coal, and I can talk about nuclear all night, but a little too expensive. We built a lot of natural gas units. But from a water usage, whether you're in the UP where we've designed some units that used to be on the back of Carnival cruise lines and ran on diesel, peaking units that use very little water. In the units we're building to support the data centers are peaker units. They're not going to be running full throttle. So like the Port Washington gas unit, which is an intermediate unit. So we're concerned about water usage too, but like to your point, it's not a showstopper. It's not. Our fleet is significantly increasing, but the water usage isn't going up as well. But on your direct question, sorry to hog the mic here, we have spent years negotiating with the data centers to address the concerns that every community has about, well, I don't want my bill going up, and what happens if they don't show up. And we have in front of state regulators right now, it sounds like a weapons system. It's not. It's called the Very Large Customer, VLC tariff. But it's really a customer protection plan. And it ensures, and then we've learned a lot from some of the other states. I want to assure you that when we were doing this and negotiating with the data centers, we've learned the lessons of some of the other states where you have seen costs go up because the customer in that case might be buying a slice of the system. All this is public, and ours is, I'm telling, because a lot of you are customers, this has been recognized as one of the best in the country. And don't ask me, talk to Microsoft, they operate in a few states. They said it's the most transparent and fair. And anyone, the commission's gonna decide that in the next couple of months, but the cornerstone is that your bill will not be going up because they're here. And we have surgically put those costs aside for all the wires, all the infrastructure they need. You know, a good example, because I'm responsible for our next rate case filing, we'll show you that, you know, over the next 2 years, the data centers are going to be charged close to $2 billion, which is not coming to our customers, our non-data center customers. And we've developed the safeguards, so for every plant, in order to be eligible for this data center protection plan and you're a data center, you have to commit to the resources you're going to use, and it's for the life of the asset. Because there's been a lot of media about, well, they're only 10-year service agreements. It's like kind of irrelevant given that, you know, for solar and for, it's a 20-year life of the asset. If they don't show up, we have an obligation to repurpose it, but if we can't repurpose it, they have to pay for all of it, backed up with credit support. So I just want to assure you as public officials, I get a question a lot. We're very proud of the work we've done. Now the commission is going to, you know, I anticipate they'll take it up sometime in April. They'll approve it with modifications, that's my guess. But in all cases, we think it's a fair deal for customers, and it delivers what everyone wants, which is fairness.
Yeah, and did you have something, Peter?
I just wanted, I'm just curious, Bert, you said 40% increase. How much of that is in renewable and how much is that in traditional power generation?
Well, I have a slide deck I can share with you that breaks that down with fancy bar graphs and charts. But, I mean, there's a heavy emphasis on solar, gas, batteries. To give you an idea, last year, state regulators were busy just with us because we got 3 gigawatts of, that's 3,000 megawatts of generation approved. And we're on tap to get another 4,000 this year. Now, keep in mind, our biggest customer in the whole state of Wisconsin is less than 100 megawatts, to give you an idea. So to accommodate these customers, you're talking 10 to 20 times the size of our largest customer today. So I'm happy to, present or send you the slide deck I use with public officials, whether I'm testifying in Madison or with local officials, because again, it's all about transparency so everyone can see that they all play a role in our system. You know, we're sort of like the conductor now. It's not just coal and gas and nuclear. You have a lot of things going on during the summer months and that. So it's an interesting time to be in our business.
So you mentioned lifespan, and there's a couple questions here that echo one of the ones that I have as well. So what is the expected useful life of something like a data center? You know, and what happens if, now the buildings are vacant, they're just sitting there? What happens to the buildings? Are there any protection for local government if a data center fails?
I mean, again, I don't want to speak too much to the, project how long these centers are going to be useful because, the technology is changing. But I think the thing for local officials to think about is, are there elements of their agreement like a guaranteed property valuation? And so again, if there's a guaranteed property valuation and the corporate entity is a going concern, which again, when you think about some of these companies like Microsoft, they're pretty stable and large companies. If that's over the period where the bonds need to be paid off or whatever improvements need to be paid off, then, and the local community believes the company will be, again, financially viable, then that issue in theory is resolved.
Peter or Bert, anything that you would want to add to?
No.
What happens to the building? No? Great.
No, all I can say is, I'm not an expert on municipal finance, but I can tell you the focus we've had is ensuring that none of these generation assets are stranded. And we've had the credit support and the commercial agreements that ensure that doesn't happen. Which
stranded would be an asset that, there is not the demand there to pay, to fully amortize the asset, right?
And in fairness, I mean, they're tough negotiators, but the data center, they are our partners. They understand that in order to get community acceptance, there can't be a perception that the communities we serve are going to be at risk. And that's been a foundational issue for us from the day they arrived here. And I have nothing, but good things to say about that because it's not an easy commercial discussion, but we worked with them to get a good place where nights like tonight we can say we've taken that risk off the table.
So if we start nudging into kind of the community side of it, from your vantage point, each of you, what's one of the biggest misconceptions that you hear from communities, both from people who are really enthusiastic and from people who might be opposed?
Well, I can tell you from my experience at public hearings in the communities, one of the biggest misconceptions, and there's handouts on this, that if you approve this data center, our residential bills will go up 200 to 300%. And my answer to that, if that's true, I would be with the protesters. Because that's just terrible public policy. And I think that together with, and this is more Peter's lane, the water usage. But again, we live in a distributed sort of social media environment where you can have one posting and it'll be sent far more than what's in the Journal Sentinel. So that, and you're the expert on this, I'm just telling you what our customers have said. And the Port Washington example is a good example because there's major concerns over water usage there. And the response from the data centers, because they use this closed loop system, is yes, we're going to use water, but it's the equivalent of 65 to 75 homes in a subdivision annually. And people don't believe them because it seems that, how can that be? Biggest capital investment, that's the system they're using, but that's more, I defer to you on that.
Yeah, I think, I look at this as a journalist and see the decline in the journalism industry over the last several decades. Megan, we could probably have a beer talking about that.
Maybe a couple, yeah.
Yeah. And so what we have here is this really transformative change that's happening economically in the country during a time of journalistic decline. And there's been a lot more heat than light, I think, in this conversation. I have definitely recognized that in the water area, which is why I used the anecdote that I was talking about earlier with Microsoft and Mount Pleasant. And so what we're seeing, and so for example, when you look at Microsoft's sustainability report, and it talks about its water consumption now, because the Mount Pleasant facility isn't even online yet, their own data isn't keeping up with their advanced technology. And so it will only be after that comes online and we have this reduction in water consumption per data output that you're going to actually even see within the self-reporting on a sustainability standpoint from these different companies what these technologies are doing. And so another thing we haven't talked about yet is ESG, or environment social governance, which is a big issue for younger generations in their 401k investments. The next generation really wants to know that their 401k is a greener 401k in many cases, not all, but in many cases. And these companies are very aware of that future marketplace. And so I think that those kinds of themes are lost in the heat and lack of light that we're seeing here. And I do hope that through good journalism and continued sessions like this to have an open discussion, it will help to sort of fight all that confusion that's out there. Because as a journalist, it's been frustrating to watch.
Jason.
Well, just really quickly, and I think we've already talked about some of the misconceptions, but maybe a more generalized one is a sense I get in many quarters that, hey, we're not getting any information about this, or we can't really know enough to make a good decision. I think in many cases, and we're still digging into this ourselves, and we hope to make more information available, but I think there is a lot of information available, and I think communities can make pretty good decisions if they give themselves the time and engage the right expertise.
Yeah, well, Jason's a recovering journalist as well. So I just think that the non-disclosure agreements have really been a disservice in terms of transparency and information.
And that's fair. And I can understand why communities would want to know, wish they had learned sooner and learned more. But I think there's still time in many cases, and that may be asking their local officials to give them the time they need. But I think at the end of the day, it's possible to for residents and their elected officials to make good decisions on these facilities. But I think that's a fair point.
So in kind of one of the veins you touched on, so if you were advising a small Wisconsin city who's receiving a first inquiry from a data center developer, say they've got you, you're starting to get some of those questions, what are some of the very first questions that the city, the municipality should ask? How do they start the discussion and just, ask some of the top things they're going to need to know?
I mean, just very quickly, I think you'd have to think about, what is the land? Does it need to be annexed? Is it, in an incorporated area or not? What level of service does it have in terms of water, sewer, power, roads, highway? What would be what improvements are needed on that parcel? What would be the financing mechanism for those improvements? The really key question is who's going to borrow the money? Is it the municipality? Is it the developer? If it is the municipality doing the borrowing through a TID, through a TIF district, then, there's got to be guarantees in place to ensure that, or provisions in place to ensure that that money can be paid off, because, again, these centers are very big. So, they can be a very big positive instrument, or they could be a big negative instrument if due diligence is not done. And then, but if on the other hand, the borrowing's being done by the private entity, then that's a different scenario in which there's less public risk. So those would be some of the immediate things that I would want to know as a citizen if there was one coming to my community. We could go on a long time, but I think those would be some of the initial questions. I'll give it to other panelists.
Yeah, you've hit the major ones. I guess the only thing I would say based on our experience, I think if I was a local official, I'd say threshold question is, given all the pressures you have on speed to market, when do you want this site energized? Because everything works back from them. The construction schedule impacts the community, road, how you're going to address that, because all of them are competing in a very, it's a hot industry, but their threshold issue is how quickly you want to be energized and in what phases, because there's a big difference between our phase 1 by 2028 is 200 megawatts versus we're going to have 3 gigs of generation in 5 years, and I think you work back from there.
Yeah, so the energy guy thinks of energy and the water guy thinks of water. So that, so I do think that, again, the key question is, the water consumption. Are they using this, cutting edge closed loop technology that I was talking about earlier? But then this isn't really a water related question, but it is a Great Lakes related question, right? So remember, the Great Lakes hold 20% of all the fresh surface water on the planet. Truly a remarkable thing. So I think about water in our region from a watershed standpoint. Is the data center inside the Great Lakes watershed, where 20% of all the freshwater, surface water on the planet is, or outside? And is it on groundwater or a river like the Fox River or whatever? And so what we have here in the region is, I don't use the term Rust Belt anymore. I like to think of us as the Blue Belt, but we have brownfield areas that are often located right by the Great Lakes that are ideal places to, from my perspective, to site a data center, because usually you have energy that's there, you have access to water if you were to need it, and there aren't a lot of neighbors who are going to whine about a data center that's ending up in a brownfield area.
So we did get this question, and it's I think slightly related to site location for some of this. So we touch on water, but how do we address farmland preservation or some of the challenges related to wastewater discharge? When we're thinking about where sites are located and how we're using land as well as water.
Yeah, so there isn't a lot of wastewater discharge when you have this closed loop system that I was talking about. So again, just to use this anecdotal example of Mount Pleasant and Microsoft, they have to use evaporative cooling when the air temperature gets above 80, 85 degrees. And that's less than 30 days per year. And that's where most of their water consumption comes from, is just basically, the July, August timeframe. And that's when they're going to have some wastewater discharge. But it's, again, from a volume standpoint, it's really minuscule.
And I know we're going to be coming to a close in just a second, but there is one last question that I just wanted to throw out, and it comes from you guys. So it was, how do communities address expertise imbalances? So when some of the world's largest companies enter into negotiations with smaller communities who might not have as favorable financial positions, how do communities begin to approach some of that imbalance?
Well, I mean, this is why we have consultants, and who are engaged on behalf of the municipality. And, we have people in the room that do some of that work and that we'll be hearing from. So I think that's, something that, and municipalities in many cases actually do, have these resources, in their networks. And don't forget that there's the League of Wisconsin Municipalities and there's the National League of Cities. And there's a lot of resources at the state and national level that communities can tap into. And, they, to the extent that they move forward with one of these projects, they have the resources to do that. So I think in some ways it's less out of balance than in many other economic development situations that I can think of.
And I'd just say, as a negotiator too, I mean, I don't care if you're the smallest community, the smallest utility, your values aren't going to change in terms of when you're sitting across the table with companies that have better credit quality in the United States government. You may be outnumbered, but I agree with it. I mean, it doesn't mean that, you're still going to advance your constituents' concerns, whether it's a huge data center or 100 megawatt. So that may be more philosophic, but that's how we approached it, because we're obviously very small from a market cap compared to the companies we're negotiating with, but it was about our values as we were negotiating with them. We weren't going to do anything that compromised that. That would be my advice, regardless of who your counsel is. You can always get lawyers. They're a dime a dozen.
And I know we've got a lot more just questions. I mean, I even have more questions, but I want to thanks, Peter, Bert, Jason, thank you so much. For anyone who had a question we did not get to, or as one that they didn't send, I believe you'll be available a little bit kind of during the post of the event, and I'm sure you'd be able to continue a future conversation as well. So thank you. I want to thank our panelists. So as we then move in, we're going to move into another presentation. We'll have a presentation, a video, and then a second panel. So as we move into this next presentation, we'll be exploring what data center development can mean for communities, both in the near term and then as we start considering into the future. And first, we'll be hearing from a local perspective. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Lehner, City Manager for the City of Janesville. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce you quick. So Kevin M. Lehner is a seasoned public sector executive with more than 25 years of experience leading municipal organizations and advancing economic development initiatives. As city manager of a community of approximately 70,000 residents, he is known for collaborative leadership, strategic problem solving, and effective negotiation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As she mentioned, my name is Kevin Lehner, and about 20 years ago or so, I was driving around the city of Burlington at my first city administrator job here in the state, and the city manager drove me past a site, and it was obviously a construction project that had stopped, and the only thing left were 2 elevator towers, and on top of the 2 elevator towers were 2 black ravens. And I remember that it's been seared into my mind to this day, and the mayor said, "You need to do something about that." Well, that turned out to be one of the most contaminated sites that I had ever seen. It was actually, I'm sorry, Bert, We Energy's former coal gasification site. And approximately 2 years later, we worked with a variety of agencies. It ended up being about a half a dozen that were involved to be able to redevelop that site into what is now actually a moderate income senior development on the banks of the Fox River, not this Fox River up here in Burlington, Wisconsin. So fast forward to driving around the city of Janesville after I'd just gotten the job as city manager, and the council president drives me past the former GM assembly plant and says, "I need you to do something about that." And so we went about a process and started the conversation about how we redevelop that site. And what I described to them at the time was that the site, if we are going to get involved with it and we are actually going to acquire it, is going to be long, hard, and expensive. And it's about a 250-acre site. And so on the northern side, down in Janesville, is where the old GM assembly plant had been. It had been operating since 1918. It closed, it stopped operation in 2009 and officially shut down in 2011. After that time, a private development firm bought it from GM, scrapped the entire site, tore down the buildings, and was intending to redevelop it, but it never happened. They got behind on their taxes, they didn't pay the utility bills, and so eventually the city, through an eminent domain statute, took possession of that property and 6 other properties in that area to form a 250-acre redevelopment brownfield site. It was about a 4.8 million square foot facility. It closed operations, as I mentioned, and the demolition of the plant occurred in 2019. And it is considered a closed brownfield site with continuing obligations. So that essentially means that the DNR has said, you don't have to do anything more with this, that it has a, quote, cap over the contamination that's there. That cap is in the form of a very large foundation and a lot of asphalt for the most part. And then you have to do different testing and stuff to make sure that any contamination isn't going anywhere off the site. It's about 250 acres, as I said, and we acquired it through the eminent domain statute. So that site currently has about 25 megawatts available to it today through Alliant Energy. And we, after acquiring the site and going through a process to consider a data center development, have an indicative study that says that they can deliver about 800 megawatts to the site within 6 years in different tranches of power. So our site is somewhat unique from what some of you are dealing with in terms of large, perhaps farm field sites that are located on the edge of communities. Ours is truly an industrial brownfield site located right in the middle of the city of Janesville. So we, just to give you a background of what we're doing right now, we are right in the middle of it, and we will determine whether or not we go forward over the next several months and ultimately years. We are in a 120-day period to negotiate a sale with a group called Viridian Partners. They are a specialized brownfield redevelopment firm, and it's really a conglomeration of them and data center companies that have done data center developments all over the country. It would consist of multiple buildings if we move forward, and it would be powered by up to 800 megawatts. And as part of our discussions, Viridian would complete a complete remediation of the site to Wisconsin DNR standards, and that is currently estimated by us to be about $30 million. They would also be responsible for all site improvements required by the city, the county, or the DOT. For Janesville, this would have huge economic impact. Our total economic impact is estimated to be about $3.7 billion and about $130 million in direct economic impact to Janesville and Rock County, with 600 permanent jobs at the end, and not counting the thousands of construction jobs during construction, and about $48 million in wages and benefits to our community. So as all of you know who are municipal officials, we have one of the most restrictive tax levy caps in the entire country. And so Janesville is no different. In addition to the restrictive tax levy cap, we also have one of the lowest shared revenues per capita in the entire state. And so as a quirk of the formula, Janesville receives significantly less than our peers, and no stub to our neighbors in Beloit, but they receive 4 times more shared revenue than we do, and we are double the size of that community. So in terms of an economic game changer for the city, it would mean $12 million annually across all taxing jurisdictions, and then $4.2 to $4.8 million annually to the city of Janesville. So, you know, one way to look at this in our community is to really turn what is a $30 million environmental liability into what is estimated to be a $1 billion investment with, in our case, no city tax dollars invested. And so some of these things are being done, and we have a TIF there right now, but if we move forward, we're going to close it because the company is not asking for any city incentives. And so we would take that $30 million environmental liability, turn into $1 billion investment. That type of support for our local economy has not been seen since the GM plant was operational. We see it as an opportunity to support family high-tech jobs, family supporting high-tech jobs. We are also, as part of the LOI, in which we'll eventually get into a development agreement, is to establish an improvement fund for Janesville's South Side in particular. And you never hear a government official say this, but we actually would have the opportunity to reduce taxes in the city. And one example in the numbers that we have run is we'd very likely be able to remove our wheel tax, which impacts every person who has a vehicle within our community. Support local job training programs, obviously support union construction jobs during the construction and during operations. And so one argument that you will hear frequently from those that do not like data centers is that the jobs are temporary. And so the construction jobs, some of them are temporary. But once those are established, those systems require constant maintenance. And if you go into a data center today, it is a Wisconsin supply chain bonanza. It is incredible, and you have multiple professionals in the HVAC and electrical and others that are in those facilities daily after they're fully constructed. And the other part of our deal is that the company would prepare other portions of our site for future redevelopment purposes. So they're not going to take up the entire 250 acres. They are going to prepare the site for us to do other development on the site. So if you have heard the word data center, you know that there is significant community concern when you mention that word. And the general theme is that there is a significant lack of trust in local government, probably in all levels of government currently. As she mentioned, I've been doing this for 25 years, and this is probably the lowest point that I've ever seen in my career. One of the things that also hurts these discussions is there's a lack of trust in technology companies. You know, I wish the CEOs of these companies weren't so quirky and weird and in the news all the time. You know, it doesn't help us. It doesn't help us at all. I mean, so you hear about that. You hear about folks worried about their data, their personal data. That is a constant theme. They are worried about the government getting their data as well. Those are constant themes that we hear in the city of Janesville. As has been mentioned, noise, water, future water rates, future energy rates, not enough jobs. Those are all the common concerns that are at the forefront of people's minds. And I think that is something that local communities, you just have to pay attention to right now. I can tell you that there's a segment of population in Janesville that is really hurting. The issue of not being able to afford, you know, groceries and gas and those sorts of things is real. It's impacting people, and so when you have a group of folks that is promoting what I would call a half-truth or a myth that your water rates are going to go up and your energy rates are going to skyrocket, that resonates. And so you have to be prepared to address those issues with your partners if you are to have a chance of moving forward with a project. I have heard that there are some legislators here. We really need statewide legislation to clarify that local consumers are not going to see their bills increase. I spoke on a couple of different bills in this last session, and as a municipal official, I don't care if they're a Democrat bill or a Republican bill, a bill needs to get passed because this discussion is impacting data center developments all across the state. I have a wide network of friends who are in the business who have paused potential projects because of this discussion. And so outside of statewide legislation, the PSC needs a clear ruling. I've been looking at the stuff and the Microsoft is trying to do. I think that's a great example. And if the PSC can come out and clearly indicate to consumers that their rates, their energy rates aren't going to go up, that would go a long way in advancing this discussion in the state of Wisconsin. So just a little bit about what we're doing. So we are going to address our community concerns through a combination of some zoning modifications and a robust development agreement. We are in the middle of updating our zoning code, completely unrelated to this project, but we are adding language into our zoning code to address this issue. But we are going to be able to negotiate, because we own the property, limits on noise, specific types of cooling systems, such as closed loop or the next greatest technology that would reduce water even more. Site layout and design, architectural requirements, required buffer zones, required community investments, local hiring requirements, and environmental cleanup requirements. And the benefits of this industry is that they will do all of this if you ask them. I won't tell you the community, but one of the local attorneys that has worked on this said he just kept on asking, and they never said no. And it all got into the development agreement. So we're going to ask for the moon, and we're going to expect it because of what this industry is and what they're able to do and the impacts that could have on our community. So I will say this is a hard discussion. It is not fun. There's a large level of concern throughout the state. And we are being criticized for our approach. I will defend our approach. I believe that we're doing it the right way. But we are continuously being criticized for our approach locally by a loud and relatively significant group of folks in our community. So we publicly shared an RFP that we issued prior to having a discussion with data center companies. So what happened to us is, because of our site, because of the uniqueness of our site, because of the ability to get power there relatively quickly, once we bought it, we started getting calls from data center developers. And once that started to kind of gain momentum, we went to the city council and we said, look, we're getting these calls. We didn't plan to do a data center, but we would be kind of negligent in our job if we didn't at least consider this. I mean, it's $1 billion investment in your community. So they said to us, go ahead and have these discussions, but make it public. Now, for better or for worse, they said make it public. So we issued an RFP, and we got responses from that. Now, while we were doing the due diligence of the companies, we did have a non-disclosure agreement, but as soon as we finished those due diligence activities, we've released all information. We've released all of the RFP responses. We've developed a website. I've held a public forum. And so we are being very transparent with our process. We are also doing a series of community workshops, and you can see them all listed there, just about anything and everything that's come up, and we're continuing to add more as topic comes up. One of the challenges is that as you address different issues, other people raise different concerns, and it kind of feeds upon itself. So we're trying to address those issues as best we possibly can. I've been presenting at business and civic groups, probably a little bit too much, because nobody wants to hear a city manager talk for that long. We've developed a GM Jacko redevelopment board. So that was our intention prior to ever discussing a data center. So we have a group of citizens, business leaders, and nonprofits that are developing a master plan for the site with or without a data center development. And we're conducting community outreach and feedback through the development of that master plan process. And so we are going to continue to do future workshops as we go forward. Really, if we move forward with this process, the real plans about what would be happening at that site. So, thank you so much, and I'm happy to be here for the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We'll be hearing from you a little bit more soon. And speaking of future, so the next thing that we're going to do is move into a conversation with Gary Golden. So he provides a great kind of future perspective, future-focused outlook. He is an academically trained futurist who explores the forces shaping society in the 21st century. His work spans social services, finance, healthcare, energy, and civic institutions. So that's him, and...
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Brooklyn, New York. My name is Gary Golden, and wanted to thank you for allowing me to join you in the conversation this evening. The perspective I want to take is that of a futurist, and try to frame the conversation around where AI and the use of AI might be in the future. So let's begin with this question of the demand for AI. What we see on the screen here is basically all the people in the world in 3.2 million people chunks. And within it, we see the current adoption of AI applications, which I'm going to highlight here in more detail. Individuals that are in the green are using AI systems for free. So the association here is that they value it, but not enough to pay for it, and they are the majority of people in the world. The yellow are individuals that see value in these services and are willing to pay and reflect really more of a mature mainstream future demand world. What we see in the red, the smallest dot, is a world where it is not human beings prompting AI to use the compute. It is AI agents or AI bots that are basically using AI to do tasks and work on our behalf. So when we think about the future, and here claims that this will be the largest infrastructure build out in human history, it aligns to the potential demand use of the future. So most expectations are that over the next several decades across the world, we are going to see about an $80 trillion build out of compute center infrastructure. So if you're looking to compare that, the United States economy is about $30 trillion a year, the global economy about $120 trillion. So it's a large number, but not so large relative to what we see today in the world. So the foundation that we're building off of in the United States is about 4,300 data centers, most of which were built out for prior use cases, kind of cloud services, memory storage, things of that nature. But when we look to the future, we need to understand that AI data centers, AI compute centers will come in two form factors. One is the large so-called hyperscaler model, where they're using these clusters to train models to create the next AI model. And that is growing, and that will continue to grow for a bit. But the future growth in this industry is for what we call inference. Inference is this idea that we infer, we're asking the model to do something. And it's important to understand that inference computer center growth is what's driving the market, because inside of an inference computer center will be different types of hardware. So just in January, NVIDIA announced its Vera model, its Vera kind of era of hardware, and these are built for so-called agentic AI. This is built not to train models, but to allow people to infer and use models to do tasks and work. And these systems are built differently. They have on-chip cooling systems, and when they announced it, the companies that built large, thermal and cooling systems, the stock of those companies went down. It's important that we understand that these data compute centers are dynamic. They are living things, and the equipment and the energy profile and the energy use within them will evolve. What I think is going to happen is that we're going to start to see a shift from the current narrative, which is training compute centers, large, many billions of dollar compute centers that use gigawatts of energy used for training, toward a world of more smaller footprint, locally placed inference compute centers. So people will always ask me, Gary, do you think that this is a bubble? Is it going to pop? And I think that the best analog is this idea of a champagne bottle, where there are big bubbles, and within it there are small bubbles, and the cork may pop at some point. But when you pop that cork of the champagne bottle, lots of things emerge. So we're going to see different form factors of compute centers in the future. So very quickly, let's just look at kind of the energy demand of these centers. AI is electricity. Electricity is AI in this context. And that the growth of data centers in terms of the grid use is growing incrementally, about 9 to 10% a year, because the reality is our grid in the United States is not necessarily built or prepared for growth. So what we see within the world of compute and data centers are new narratives, new stories, new solutions, where we're going to be looking at all the internal systems within these data centers, looking for areas to gain efficiency. Instead of drawing energy from the grid or drawing water from the outside, we're going to build things on site in a distributed, decentralized manner. So we as a region want to be focusing on the emerging narrative, the emerging solutions, and imagine how we as a region within Wisconsin and close by, what are the businesses and what are the talent demands for creating solutions for on-site energy, and how do we get involved in creating solutions to cool and address kind of heat transfer issues within these centers. This is the opportunity. So broadly speaking, the benefit of AI is that these systems are able to solve problems that humans have been unable to solve today. There was a wonderful essay by Dario Amodei called Machines of Loving Grace, where he says, look at that computer rack as a researcher that's able to, cure cancer. Look at that computer rack as someone that's able to develop a social system to help alleviate poverty. So thinking of the opportunity of these data and compute centers as a resource to solve local and regional challenges, I think is a future-proof and a future-oriented perspective. How we negotiate with these compute centers, hey, we want tokens, we want compute that's happening on this site to be used to help uplift people and businesses and our governments locally. So there's enormous opportunity ahead if we look beyond this hyperscaler large data center model towards a world where inference compute centers that are smaller and more distributed across the region are really the focus of growth. So I'm happy to be sharing an additional recording here for you to take away and look at when you have more time. And I hope the conversation tonight has been fruitful. And again, thank you all for inviting me to join you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's not the first time I've heard Gary speak, so I say he always gives me something new to consider. So from here, we're going to jump into our next panel discussion, and this one is going to be centered around community impact. So it's focused on perspectives related to that impact and a future outlook, which I think both Kevin and Gary did a good job of setting us up to head right into that discussion. So I want to start by welcoming the panelists, and then I'll do a brief introduction for all of you. So welcome up. Kevin's already with me. Thank you so much for joining us. So we've already met Kevin, City Manager for the City of Janesville. Thank you for joining us. And then I also want to welcome Dale Lewis. So Dale Lewis is a seasoned data center construction executive with 40 years of experience overseeing large-scale complex projects. His expertise includes regulatory compliance, risk mitigation, and stakeholder coordination with a focus on delivering efficient and cost-effective outcomes. Welcome. Oh, it's on. Good. Okay. And then Todd Taves is a senior municipal advisor with Ehlers, specializing in capital markets transactions and economic development for Wisconsin communities. With more than 20 years of experience, he has created or amended over 250 tax incremental financing districts. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you'll see again, our Mentimeter QR code is in that top corner. So please feel free to send questions as we go. As you will see, I'll have them throughout, and I'll kind of weave them in like I did last time. But I'd like to begin with just kind of an opening question. So, in the previous panel, we heard a good amount about infrastructure. So as we move to community impact, from each of your perspectives, what does this type of development actually mean at the local level? What's the most important distinction between how it looks like on paper versus how it's going to look like in practice?
I'll touch on that just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, the one thing that I will say, and that is a reality of these sites, is that they're very large with, as compared to like a manufacturing center with a relatively smaller number of jobs, right? However, the jobs that are created are typically in the higher end when it comes to those that are being supported by that job. And you have to, recognize that manufacturing in the world is changing. And so we're never going to have a GM plant again in the city of Janesville that's going to employ, up to 4,000 people at a time. That's just not the way manufacturing is done today. And so from that standpoint, the amount of economic value, the amount of long-term sustainability into a community like ours is hugely substantial. As we look forward, right now, the city of Janesville is 2 to 3 years away from having an operating referendum, like many communities in the state of Wisconsin. And with this type of development, we would not have to do that for many, many years. So that's kind of the game-changing nature of a development like that from a local perspective.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think more generically, and Kevin alluded to this in his presentation, with levy limits, municipalities are really in need of continuing new development in order to gain that net new construction. So obviously many potential economic benefits of a project like this. I tend to think about it in terms of budgets and tax levies and tax rates based on the nature of the type of evaluation and work that we do. But for communities that are looking at these large projects, fundamentally what it's doing is creating potentially a much larger tax base. We all know that none of us like to pay property taxes, but we've got a pretty significant property tax burden in Wisconsin that's largely borne by residential property owners. So one of the benefits of this is, with a project of this magnitude, shifting that tax burden from that residential sector onto that commercial and industrial sector. On the flip side of that, when you have concentration, where you've got a very large property tax payer paying a large portion of your tax levy, there's also certain risks associated with that as well. But I would also say that, this isn't completely new. Data centers are the topic that we're talking about here this evening. But when I hear comments or questions about data centers and talking about that tax-based concentration and that risk, we've got that. A great example, I think, is the city of Verona with the Epic campus. That project makes up a fairly significant part of the city's tax base. So this isn't completely new in terms of having large-scale projects. It's just that data centers are the large-scale projects of the moment.
Yeah, to add to that, I look at data center development as, or the technology behind it, this is the fifth utility. It's on top of gas and water and all of these utility improvements we've made over the years. Now it's data center coming in as the fifth utility, and there's been no other industry in the history of the United States that has made this level of investment back into its infrastructure improvements. And that's tremendous when you see these kinds of investments being made in a community. The fifth utility, the fifth industrial revolution, we could call it, because the capital behind it, the numbers that we're seeing, even for me being in the industry, I still am amazed by the numbers that we work with. It's a lot, and it's a lot for any community to take in, to understand, because it seems surreal, but these are Fortune 500 companies, trillion-dollar companies that are making these investments. I like to call it the largest redistribution of wealth, again, that our country has ever seen, because of the level of investment coming to the communities. That works its way down, trickles down through the community across all sectors of business and economic development. The jobs that are created, the companies that are formed to support these facilities in local markets, if it's managed correctly from a municipal level, it can be a real boon for any community that is lucky enough to attract it.
Yeah, so Dale, I want to delve into a little bit of one of the things you touched on there. So, what would be indicators that a project is being developed in a responsible way versus one where a community should maybe be going a little deeper, asking a little, more, a little harder, pointed questions?
Sure. I'd like to touch on NDAs because we talk about that a little bit here.
You did, yeah.
NDAs, standard practice that have been used by all industries and all businesses for years. They were typically implemented to protect trade secrets from competition. They weren't developed to hide information from the community, to slip something under the table. And the data center industry is not immune to using NDAs, but we get a bad rap for it. So, like any other industry that has to pivot because of a situation that's developed from the way they operate, we're slow at it, right? So Microsoft just made an announcement that they'll no longer use NDAs for any of their future developments in any municipality. And that is the industry pivoting to a more transparent way of operating. We realize that because it's such a focus topic right now, that when a development comes to community, they need to be transparent from day one. And another example, there's a company, a developer down in Coal City, Illinois. Before they even got in front of the municipality with a design to go through land entitlement process, they set up community workshops where they take the high school gymnasium and they bring all of their representatives from different areas within their organization and have little kiosks set up and invite the community to come in and look at what their planned design is and how it's going to impact each and every one of their concerns. That is, I'd like to say that it's happened quickly because it's only been, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 months that we've been experiencing this kind of community pressure. But for a company like that to make that kind of a transition and be so transparent, I think is a valiant effort on their part to be a part of the community.
So as we are talking about some of the idea of transparency and what the community conversation around something is, Kevin, I want to throw a question at you, kind of in looking and listening to the presentation you had. One of the questions I had was, how did you arrive at some of the elements that you included in, the agreement, in your approach, and, how did you know what was important to include, in that approach?
So as we've been going through this process, we spent a lot of time talking to folks and trying to gain as much information as we possibly could. And so we actually traveled to Loudoun County, Virginia, and Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, and looked at and went into data centers in those locations. And then we talked to the community leaders in those places to talk about what had happened in their communities, what were their challenges, what should we be cognizant of, and what we should plan for. And the issues that you're hearing from folks that are concerned are the ones that they are addressing in those locations. And so we had to educate ourselves very fast, and we still are, about how we best incorporate protections for our community into our development agreements and zoning codes and things like that. So we went and talked to people who have actually done it. If you think about, like Loudoun County, they have hundreds within a very concentrated area. Dallas-Fort Worth, they're building them very, very quickly. I stood on the pad of what was going to be a 1.6 gigawatt data center site that was master planned as part of a residential community. So the data center was going in first, and there was 2,000 homes going in around it after. So we, and I continue to spend a lot of time on the phone with folks who are just having that direct experience and trying to discern what is the best things that we need to do and learn from their challenges and actually learn from their mistakes where those were made as well.
So, Todd, if we kind of, say, hey, there's the sort of a community conversation that's happening, if you're a municipal leader, what are some of the financial questions or guardrails that you suggest municipalities, ask before moving the data center conversation too far down the road?
Sure, and I'd like to kind of go back to one of the issues that came up in the prior panel relative to communities being perhaps in a disadvantaged position when negotiating with these large companies. And I think one of the things that's really important is if you are approached, if you have an interest in these types of projects, you really need to look at assembling that team of professionals that was referenced on the early end. It's not uncommon or unreasonable for a municipality to ask a interested developer to enter into a pre-development agreement, which essentially says that we have to undertake certain due diligence to assess what the benefits, risks, et cetera, are to our community, and we need to enlist potentially attorneys, financial folks, engineers to make that assessment. So I guess I would start by saying that you've got to get that team on board to really understand and quantify what it is you're looking at. There are potential operating costs. I know one of the things that's often talked about is the data centers are fairly low impact on services, and I think that is probably true relative to other alternative land uses that could develop in that same footprint, but nevertheless they do require public safety services, public works services, so you've got to do that internal assessment on whether or not you've got the organic capability to absorb that or whether there may be additional costs. And then certainly the capital component. Kevin's project is interesting in that you've got an infill site that has much of the municipal service already available to it, whereas in Port Washington they are building out all of that infrastructure, which was also the case in Mount Pleasant. So you really need to do that front-end due diligence, quantify what the costs are, who's going to bear the costs, who's assuming the risk as you start to work towards putting a term sheet and a development agreement together. So, we're starting to touch on kind of some of the larger considerations, and anytime, you make a decision to or not to, there are trade-offs. So from your perspective, what are some of the trade-offs that communities should be kind of most thoughtful in weighing as they consider to data center or not to data center?
I don't think they really have to give anything up, honestly. I think data center operators need to be transparent, like I mentioned, but the data center industry isn't really looking for handouts at the moment. Now, don't get me wrong, like any other industry and any other business, if there's a TIF or a TID in place, they will take advantage of it. They have a bottom line just like anybody else. If there's a tax incentive in a particular state, that makes their business model attractive. All industries use those incentives. But at the same time, our industry is flourishing. It is growing at a rapid pace, and the desire to get the technology to the market, I outweighs any other obstacle that these developers might face. So any community, like I said, that is lucky enough to attract a data center, a potential data center proposal, you can ask for everything that your heart desires or your community is demanding, and they will deliver.
Yeah, I would just add, we have to recognize that these conversations are hard. And I don't have to tell the folks here who have sat in a public meeting and had public comment after public comment come up and talk about, how terrible these things are. So they're hard conversations to have. As city leaders, I think that you have to be willing to have those conversations and to take the time to understand the benefits and the drawbacks, and to really try to form a collaborative partnership with the different stakeholders to move a project forward. The conversation in the city of Janesville is ongoing. There are folks there that really do not like that we're having this conversation, and they're going to let their elected leaders know that on a regular basis. But I think that you have to be willing to have it, especially in the context of the economic impact that these projects can have on your community, but also in the state as a whole. The amount of times that the dollar gets reinvested in the state for every project is tremendous, and I think that's really important to remember as well.
So we have a question that's in the vein of, in the last panel we talked about some of the site locations, and this question seeks, and maybe Kevin, I'll throw it to you first, although you don't know what I'm going to ask yet. Is any perspective on legislation or policy that would steer data centers to areas that would see the biggest economic impact? So they use an example of brownfield versus greenfield, low socioeconomic versus high.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one for me to answer, just because, we're not always part, in our case, we're part of the chain of custody of the property. But if you have, the people that own a lot of land in the state of Wisconsin are a lot of farmers. And so if there's a willing seller that wants to get top dollar for their property, and they're near 347 kV line in the state, they're going to be approached about that, and then that community has to make that determination. I know that there's a lot of concern, especially in our area, about farmland preservation, but at the same time, private property owners have a right to develop or sell their property as they see fit. So that's a trade-off. I like our story. I couldn't pick a more perfect place to do a development of this kind, just because of the uniqueness of it, and the challenges there. But there are that sort of trade-off. As I drove by the Port Washington site today. That's a game changer for that community from an economic perspective. I think their entire infrastructure, nearly the entire infrastructure for their community, is being rebuilt by one investment. So those are really, I think, very localized discussions to have, in my view.
I don't know, Todd or Dale, are there anything from your perspective you would want to add?
The data center industry has been self-governed for a very long time because we've flown under the radar. Nobody really cared what was happening in the past because they just wanted the internet and they didn't care how it got built. Plus the facilities were much smaller, so they were built under the radar. Nobody was really paying attention. But as they've grown and gotten more exposure, as part of our transparency efforts, we are asking legislators to put protections into place that give the community a confidence level, that it's being managed by the government. Guardrails are being put in place to give them assurances that environmental impacts are being managed, water usage, electrical usage, noise, light, carcinogens, Tier 4 generators. These are the things that matter to the community. And as an industry, we've used Tier 4 generators because the industry's been very aware of their environmental footprint. So they've been early adopters of technology that reduces their carbon footprint and have been self-governed in that manner to plug those efficiencies into their business model. But to have legislators create those guardrails are what's going to give the community confidence, and I think that that's the required next step in the evolution of data center development.
Yeah, and so Dale, I want to poke again. So knowing that you're with Bolt Construction, we've touched a little bit on what does it look like from a job creation standpoint as well. So the workforce outlook at the construction level is a little different from where it looks like from a permanent employee picture. And I know Kevin, you touched on this as well. What should communities expect during the build process? What should they expect beyond?
So in the build process, it's I'll start by saying that all construction jobs are temporary, because we hear that a lot, that, well, you're going to drive all these temporary construction jobs, but after the construction's done, there's going to be like 20 people in the building. I actually reached out to operations directors that I know in my circle and asked them in these new campuses, these AI facilities, what are your true hiring numbers? How many numbers are you planning to pull in, recruit, and staff these facilities? Because these facilities are new and relatively new to the industry in their size and scale. We didn't have a lot of data to draw from before. Mechanically, they're a lot more intensive than data centers we built 20 years ago. They require a lot more continuous maintenance, monitoring, and upkeep of these facilities. So the amount of people that is required to manage them has increased with their size and scale. I was getting, after I collected all of the data from the HR people at these facilities, it's roughly 1.5 jobs, FTE, full-time, family supporting jobs in each building per megawatt of deployment. So 100 megawatt facility, 150 full-time people required to support that facility every day. That doesn't include the amount of jobs that are created outside the four walls of that facility to support it from a maintenance perspective, a supply. They got kitchens, they've got gyms, they've got full-time security staff, they've got people that have to come in and manage the water systems, they've got people that have to come in and take out the trash and shovel the sidewalks at these facilities. So there's a lot of support staff that are required. That is from what I've been told from other people who collect this data, that's a 7 times multiplier over the 1.5 jobs per megawatt. So that's 8.5 jobs per megawatt that are created from a new facility today. That's a pretty significant impact, in my opinion.
So I actually, so using that as a little bit of a jumping off point, I want to go back to a question we actually got when we had our Mentimeter going for panel 1, because I think it's maybe a little bit more interesting here. And they had asked, could you give, and Kevin, Todd, I think this would be equally great for you, can you give an overview of the development economics of these facilities to really shed light on why incentives at the state or local level would be necessary?
So in the case of both Mount Pleasant and Port Washington, you had significant public infrastructure builds. In both cases, incentives were provided. In the case of Mount Pleasant, and I should say both within the architecture of a tax increment financing district. In the case of Mount Pleasant, the incentives were essentially the provision of the infrastructure and development-ready sites with the county and the village financing the improvements and recovering those costs over time. In Port Washington, a similar situation, very significant public infrastructure requirements, both to get to the site as well as to rehabilitate existing sanitary sewer, water infrastructure. In this case, the developer assumed the risk, but that sort of begs the question, should you have to do that at all? It's a negotiation. You look at every site differently, you look at every deal differently. I think one of the things, and again, this goes back to the negotiating posture, I think that the data center developers are certainly seeing what's happening in Wisconsin. They're seeing the opposition, and I think your starting point should not be to necessarily offer any incentives, rather to quantify what is needed and then look for the data center developer to pay that. I mean, that's really the ultimate objective, is to gain the benefit of the project without having, clearly you may have operating costs in terms of public safety, public works, and so forth, but in terms of having another party finance that public infrastructure without any public recovery of those dollars. So, bottom line is local communities have to make that assessment on how important the project is to them, whether or not they're willing to offer incentives, and then going through that negotiating posture. But my first advice to a municipality would be to start from the position that you wish to develop here, you're going to pay for all the associated costs of that development.
And Kevin, I'd like to go to you then.
Yeah, similar to what Todd said, I think it's really a localized issue. Our site is unique in terms of we have adequate capacity for water, sewer there because of the fact that it was a former GM site. And so we have the infrastructure, we have the water, we have the sewer capacity. So that gives us an advantage in terms of the site itself. And the reason why a company is willing to take on the environmental remediation is because their infrastructure costs on the other side aren't as great to make the site development ready. The other thing that I would say about that is that it's, in the alternative, we've had this site for a little less than a year. We've been approached by a major manufacturer who wants to locate there, and the first question is, what is your TIF incentive? And that is the reality of nearly every other industry in the state of Wisconsin that's going to come and evaluate your site. So that's the reality that we live in, and we know it. And so it's hard to fathom the amount of investment that's occurring. But as you can see, if you have visited any of these sites or seen pictures of them, it's real and it's happening.
So from each of your vantage points, so if data centers are developed there, if they're not, how would you see that shaping kind of Wisconsin communities and economies, whether development is pursued or not? So how do data centers impact Wisconsin communities and economics?
Well, obviously the level of investment that's driven from them coming to a community and developing out the parcel, there's two gates for data centers these days. Number one is power. If you have power, you have a position of leverage. Second is community acceptance, because right now the community, and depending on how sophisticated they are at organizing, what kind of tools they use, and how sophisticated your village officials are, that is what's going to trigger a desire for a development to come to the community. If you have those two things, the investment made back into the community is significant. And at the end of the day, once the facility is up and operational and the community understands that it is a rather benign building, you could drive by it and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and a conventional warehouse, except for the lack of trucking. That's, at that moment in time, I think that's when the community will start to trust the industry and trust the council members who make those decisions.
So recognizing we're already coming to the end of our second panel, I want to kind of end with a question for all of you. So what does a genuinely good outcome look like for a community? What does a poor outcome look like? And what would be warning signs that things might be headed in a direction we need to correct for?
From my standpoint, I think it always starts with knowing your community values and recognizing what your community needs are. So a positive outcome for us would be to move forward with our proposed data center development with all the protections in place to make sure that our quality of life is maintained and that the community investment remains in the community. A negative outcome would be that that it doesn't go forward, and that we earn a reputation as a community that's not open to new economic development, and that we're difficult to work with. And if you have that reputation, it's hard to recover from.
Oh, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a good outcome, again, I'm looking at this financially.
Of course, yeah.
The end goal is an expanded tax base and relieving some of that burden on the residential property tax base, along with all the other ancillary economic benefits beyond just property taxes. In terms of a poor outcome, I guess I would just suggest that, that's where that front end due diligence and crafting an appropriate development agreement, you're trying to avoid that potential outcome. In my mind, a bad outcome would be a situation where the municipality is fronting the cash through issuing municipal obligations, and then you have a situation where the facility is no longer in operation, property values diminish, and you have an insufficiency of revenues to repay that obligation without good recourse against the developer or the facility. So, in my mind, a good plan, a good agreement going in that assesses and mitigates the municipal risk is really the key to success, rather than letting you kind of wander into a potential bad outcome.
And Dale, what about from your perspective?
Well, a great outcome is the facility comes to town, develops out, and proves that it is a great job creator, a great member of the community, supportive of the community, and is a benign structure that doesn't really impact the municipality from a load perspective. A bad outcome is that it doesn't show up at all, and none of these jobs come to fruition. This tax base doesn't get subsidized by the data center development, and the community loses out on an amazing economic opportunity.
And thank you. I like ending with a question like that, because it just shows a good idea of kind of what's in balance. Where are some of the best benefits? Where are the things that really need to be considered as you wade into that conversation? So I want to kind of thank our panelists. So Kevin, Dale, Todd, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn us over to Barbara, who will bring us to a close. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to chat with all of you tonight. I know that she'll touch on it, there'll be another little thing at the end before everybody goes home. And with that, here's Barbara.
Thanks, Megan. Oh, I get your microphone. This is like the special microphone that's been held all day. Hi, everyone. It's nice and warm. Thanks, Megan. Well, thank you, Megan, and thank you so much for all of our speakers and our presenters. Can we give them another round of applause? Thank you. You may be wondering who I am. I am Barbara Koldos, and I am with New North. I had the pleasure of working alongside our ragtag team of planners to put this event together. This includes UWGB, thank you, the Greater Green Bay Chamber, Progress Lakeshore, Kane Communications, and our New North team. So thank you so much, everyone, for all the work that we put together for this event. We also appreciate Bolt and WPS Foundation for their support. I also want to say thank you to UWGB staff. Thank you so much for putting up with us and getting everything ready and set. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. So we hope tonight provided you with a clear and fact-based understanding of data centers and what they mean for your communities. Our intention was really to provide a neutral and educational space to support informed conversations. We appreciate your engagement and your efforts. We saw through Mentor that there were some questions on if the presentation would be available. The answer is yes. New North has a New North Data Center Resource Hub. The video for tonight, as well as the presentations, will be available on that site as well. I'll follow up with you, to those who registered, for links to that. So, and with that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sitting for 2 hours. That was not fun. I get that. So thank you so much. And then there are desserts and additional refreshments. So please enjoy them while you continue your conversations and have a great evening. Drive safe.